Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. In 2017, it was announced that 3 new voids were found within the Great Pyramid of Giza, but we haven't heard much about the big one from the team since then. This more accessible one near the front of the pyramid got the majority of the focus at first. The other one was just a small space by the Nook. But finally, Egyptology has turned its attention back to the internal structure known as the ScanPyramids Great Void. We learned of a mission to enter it this year, and Ancient Architects recently made a video on the subject. He also then made another video discussing new hieroglyphics found in the relieving chambers. I don't think he explicitly says it, but we're all thinking it, right? Those two things are related to each other. I'll show you in this video why I think researchers were even in the king's relieving chambers in the first place. I don't think they were looking at hieroglyphics. That was just a happy accident. I think they're looking for a good place to snake a camera. We haven't been given a lot of information about the void itself because the team only has their muography scans to go on, and scientists tend to be very careful about saying things they aren't sure about. They are willing to give only vague estimates, and the media parrots that. But scientists often know way more than they're letting on. When they say, "I don't know," that could mean everything from "there's no evidence" to "I'm only 99% confident." I think a lot of the misinformation by both legacy and social media comes from the fact that there are vastly different fields of science at play here. Egyptology, and frankly all social sciences, are soft science. Soft science is still real science. Don't confuse it for pseudoscience. But you often can't calculate your confidence levels as precisely as in hard science. The ScanPyramids team is mainly comprised of physicists, who, by a wide margin, tend to be the most conservative group when it comes to making announcements, often requiring a 5 sigma confidence level before publishing anything. So people like that are going to speak very differently than people commonly talking to Egyptologists would. Peer-reviewed physics journals is not the place for speculation. YouTube is. So let's take what we know for sure and see what we can glean from the data that the scientists aren't comfortable speculating on. I don't mind having large error bars as long as I explain that error range. I want to see if what's publicly available is enough to give us size, shape, and location for the void. The first source of this information is the ScanPyramids team themselves. I've pulled a few peer-reviewed articles that they've written where they use hard data, as well as a Reddit AMA they did in a more casual setting. The team itself explicitly say there is not enough information to speculate on orientation or shape, but personally, I think that's just physicists speak for not high enough confidence level. Not that they don't have a pretty good idea. They just won't say so publicly. They did say flat out that it's at least 30 meters long and that the center of the void that they detected is about 40 to 50 meters above the floor of the Queen's chamber. Both of these are indisputable, but there is way more information between the lines to pull out by doing our own analysis. Let's first confirm the claims that they have made, so that we're both sure that we understand the data and that we get the same results. In order to do that, let's look at some of the data they provided. This is a visual representation of the muography data. This extra bit here is the unexpected void, and you can see that it basically parallels the Grand Gallery labeled B. Now, you can also see why it's important to understand the difference between someone saying it's a minimum of 30 meters and an estimate of 30 meters. They have no idea how long this is because the void runs off the image. 30 meters only represents the smallest possible length to the edge of the projection, which is shown in green. But it can continue for any distance beyond that. This is the only information we have about length that we can glean from this angle, simply because we can't see where it ends. We can only see where it starts. The start of the new void seems to be in line with the Grand Gallery itself, possibly slightly north of it. From the known angle from this location from the sensors, the south end of the Grand Gallery is pretty much directly above us, and the void signal starts basically in the same spot. This allows us to know that the void, or at least most of it, starts just north of the line with the Grand Gallery and the sensor, and goes at least to the end of the reference frame, and possibly further. So somewhere in this green area, and possibly an unknown distance into the yellow. The next question that you may have is exactly how is it located relative to the Grand Gallery, east and west? You may expect that in order to show up in parallel to the Grand Gallery in the pictures, it must be off to the east side, right? Well, no, because the sensor isn't directly beneath it. There were actually 2 muographs taken in the Queen's chamber, and they were spread out from each other as far as possible to get a binocular view above it. One set was shoved up against the west wall of the Queen's chamber, and the other was placed inside the tunnel leading from the niche. So the void is directly above the Grand Gallery, and that's how we know. It's not off to either side. That's an illusion that you'd expect from the offset of a binocular image. Put your finger in front of your nose and close one eye. It'll appear to be one side of your nose. Close the other eye, it'll switch to the other, but in reality they're directly in line. Here you see the new void on both sides of the gallery, depending on the position of the sensor. Some quick trigonometry allows us to verify that the ScanPyramids team's claim that it's 40 to 50 meters above the Queen's chamber floor is in fact correct. This helps us solidify where this part of our diagram must be located. Now let's talk orientation and size. ScanPyramids is not willing to speculate about shape at all, only that it's a minimum 30 meters long and is obviously longer than it is wide, which we can see in the 2 images that I've shown so far. But they took another muograph from the north side, so let's take a quick look at that. This third type of detector was aimed at the north face of the pyramid and also captured the anomaly in Grand Gallery. This exposure was done in order to help confirm the ScanPyramids north passage behind the chevrons. That's the big green spot down at the bottom. But up in the image, there are the other subtle structures. From this angle, we are looking at the Grand Gallery almost head-on, which is why it's such a small part of this image, labeled C. It's a long structure, but not very wide. The Great Void anomaly from this angle also appears very small. It almost looks identical to the Grand Gallery, making it seem like the Great Void has a nearly identical cross-section to the Grand Gallery, at least from north and from underneath. So, because of the small cross-section from the north, we can update our diagram and remove everything from outside of that projection. This leaves us with basically the only option being a mirror to the Grand Gallery. We can go further. Because of its projection, we've limited the shape and orientation of the void to basically being a second Grand Gallery. But if it were an exact copy, then it should have the same strength of the signal. But it's weaker from underneath, which means it's smaller. So it must be either narrower and or not as tall as the Grand Gallery. We can also see a slightly weaker signal from the north image too, but interestingly, it's proportional. This indicates that the proportion of the cross-section from this angle is the same as the proportion of the cross-section from the bottom. What does this tell us? If this signal from the Grand Gallery is from a 50-meter long space, and we've already accounted for the reduction in the signal from the cross-section underneath, this would imply that the depth of the void from this angle is about the same as the Grand Gallery. So I think we can safely extend that 30 meters that goes off of the muograph out to 50 to account for this. I believe we can very confidently say that this is the layout of the Great Void. Certainly not confident enough for a physicist to claim a discovery. But I start my videos explicitly saying we're coming to tentative conclusions here. This is the benefit of doing our own analysis. This isn't a guess, this isn't conjecture. That's the shape and position of the void gathered purely from what's been shown to us. I also believe the team were much more confident in their initial knowledge amongst themselves and Egyptologists they talked to than they were with the media. Let's read from Mark Lehner's book, Giza and the Pyramids, from just after this discovery. Quote, "At that angle, it doesn't make much sense for it to be a chamber that would contain artifacts, burials, and objects of that sort of thing." End quote. None of the publicly facing information said anything about an angle, Mark. They actually specifically said it wasn't determinable. Now, circling back around to something I said at the start of the video. We know ScanPyramids has continued to scan the pyramid, but they're remaining tight-lipped and haven't published anything new that's useful to citizen scientists. There has been more than enough time for them to complete their scans. By now, I'm pretty confident that they now have their 5 sigma and they know exactly where the void is. If it's precisely where my analysis of the preliminary data says it is, then the king's relieving chambers will be the shortest and easiest path to it. I think they're actively looking to see if there is a crack that they can snake a camera through, or, very least, find a convenient place to drill. They just happened to find new hieroglyphics while doing that. In fact, let's take a look at the relieving spaces for ourselves. I think it's safe to ignore the lower 3. They're simply not high enough. But the very top chamber is about the right height, and it's the only one that isn't cased in granite. That's interesting. Maybe it's telling us something. Let's actually look at that wall. That's a nice flat course of masonry on the left side of the north wall, isn't it? The last stone is also right on the same course and level with everything else. So what the hell is going on here? Can you guess where about the Grand Gallery would be? Yeah, if there was a tunnel somewhere on this wall to get into something directly above the Grand Gallery, this is the location it would have to be. But wait, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe there is just some fuckery going on in this entire space. What do the other walls look like? Well, they all seem to have pretty much flat courses. Although there is 1 or 2 stones that are offset, doesn't seem to be the same degree. So there appears to be something screwy with the east side of the north wall right in front of the void. I really hope the team has spent at least a little bit of time investigating this small block right here. If you watched Ancient Architects' video on the hieroglyphs, pop quiz. Which chamber did they find them in? Here's his thumbnail. Not kidding. Not only is he showing the top relieving chamber, he's literally circled the stone that we just looked at on the north wall. Even though almost all of his video dealt with hieroglyphics actually found on the west wall. The Egyptologists seem to be poking around exactly where I said they would be. I've shown you pairings diagrams. Let's now take a look at the actual chamber. Perfect. They did a laser scan, and I found a nice 3D model of the data. I'm pretty sure it's actually the same one ancient architects showed in his video. Yep, that's Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, alright. You can even see the hieroglyphics from his video right there. Okay, so all we gotta do is turn the camera a little to the north. Any second, we're gonna see that stone. Get hyped, here it comes. Motherfucker. Yeah, they didn't scan this part of the chamber. I guess it got a little cramped. I'm actually not sure I've ever seen a picture of that spot. But we can see why no one really has gone to see it close. It's a really tight space. What a tease. If you know of a picture of this wall, please comment below. I really want to see it. So, the red line seems to be the path the team is attempting to take to the Great Void. Though I imagine as a last resort, theoretically, they could go straight up along the yellow path, but drilling into a ceiling would be much more difficult and noticeable. So, with the size and the shape of the Great Void tentatively pinned down, we can work forwards with that assumption. So, if that assumption is correct, what is this space for? One of the biggest differences between real science and pseudoscience is the ability to predict things. So let's make a scientific prediction. Being directly above the Grand Gallery and seeming to mirror it, I predict we're going to find a relieving space and nothing more. Actually very similar to the North Passage the team also found. I will be very curious to see if it's a vaulted ceiling or a corbelled one, as the Great Pyramid used both. Personally, I'd assume a corbelled one simply because of the slope, similar to the Meidum corbelled spaces above the downward passage, or the Grand Gallery itself. As far as I know, the Egyptians never built a vaulted ceiling anything but perfectly level. And if they'd already built a corbelled one below in the Grand Gallery, why wouldn't they just repeat that? Though, it does seem that the architects of Khufu preferred the vaulted design. I'm not sure why. Maybe they felt it was stronger, which it is, or maybe just because it took up less vertical space. So I suppose we might find a roof similar to the one found in the ScanPyramids corridor. However, I doubt they'll just take that and rotate it. If this is purely for weight relief, then they probably built it as a series of steps if it's vaulted, because like I said, angling a vaulted stone is something we've never seen before. It's a long, narrow void, oriented exactly the same as the Grand Gallery, and directly above it. So, a relieving chamber is not only the most likely candidate for what we see, it's really the only logical conclusion in my opinion. As sad as that is, a new insight into their construction would be amazing too. There are plenty of nerds like me who are just as interested in seeing the ancient equivalent of a rafter crawl space as a burial chamber. That said, while I just made a video outlining that I believe the Grand Gallery had no use beyond plugstone storage and as a glorified hallway, there are plenty of reasonable theories about it being used for construction, and notice I clarified that it's the only logical case in my opinion. I don't reject this idea that it could have been used for construction. I just don't see enough evidence for it now. But if the Grand Gallery had a construction usage, it's a reasonable leap to assume a copy above it would either serve the same purpose or a complementary purpose. I think the presence of anything in this space would lean strongly towards both it and the Grand Gallery having some construction usage. If it's an entirely unpolished, dusty nothing, then it leans towards the Grand Gallery having no use, as it only gets you halfway up the pyramid, and whatever it was used for would either need a replacement or must no longer be necessary by that point. It'll be particularly strong evidence for a construction usage if at the top of the Great Void there is another great step with a rope trench in it, like what existed at the top of the Grand Gallery before the Ministry of Antiquities plastered over it. Hopefully, later this year or in 2027, we will finally get a look inside. I imagine it'll be another camera snake like the North Passage, but I've greatly enhanced my video processing tools since my second video, and will be here with those. So subscribe and I'll give you a better look inside than anyone else within a day or so of its official release. Zahi Hawass stated his intent to livestream the discovery, and you can be sure I'll be there watching and processing whatever images I can. I'll have advanced images from the stream on social media likely as it's happening. And if there are subtle workers' marks that need advanced processing, I'll probably spot them before anyone else. While I think a relieving chamber to protect the Grand Gallery is almost certainly what we'll find, and I already addressed construction usage, there is another reasonable possibility that fits into this volume that we've settled on. The Meidum, Red, and Bent pyramids of his father all have systems of rooms offset in elevation, which could appear similar to an angled hallway on a muograph. I have made videos on all of these, and believe them to be designed for Snefru and his Ka. But Khufu only made one major pyramid, and the minor ones that we know as his was for his wife. Perhaps Khufu streamlined this into 3 smaller chambers within his main pyramid, and just put them above the Grand Gallery for some reason. I suppose it's possible there is a series of small chambers here, filled with ceremonial burial goods, Ka statues, stuff like that. If no one has been in there since the Old Kingdom, we could potentially learn a lot from artifacts within. That would depend, though, on whether or not there's a hidden way into this chamber, and if there is, whether or not the New Kingdom still knew that or not. It would be very interesting to find Sate period artifacts in there, like we did in Menkari's pyramid, but it would be really cool to find undisturbed Old Kingdom burial goods. I suppose another purpose for a series of spaces is a magazine system. Every mastaba for kings before the 4th dynasty have magazines of resources for the afterlife. Then, from Menkari onwards, pyramids also have them. So why didn't Khufu need a magazine chamber of resources? Did he have a different religion? There's no evidence for that at all, so perhaps that's what this is. I know what some of you might be thinking. The cross-section of a magazine set would not match what we see from the North Muograph, a very long, skinny space. But the magazines themselves might not show up on the scan. If the magazines are for burial goods, and they've never been found and looted, they might still be full, and therefore would absorb muons. Muography detects air pockets, not structures. Khufu has been a historical ghost. His burial goods would shine a spotlight on the man himself. We'd learn his favorite foods, his hobbies, and so much more, so we can hope. Another mark against this idea, though, is that magazines were usually directly connected to the antechamber or tomb. Now, that may not be absolutely necessary, as once dead, a king can use spiritual doors to pass through walls, and it seems to have been less necessary the further back in time you go. The left image is the 5th dynasty Unas pyramid, and the magazines are directly next to the antechamber. But the right image is the 3rd dynasty pyramid of Sekhemkhet, and these magazines are much further away from the burial chamber. Considering my position that it's probably a relieving chamber, I don't expect to find any artifacts or resources at all. Perhaps a leftover Old Kingdom tool, like the Dixon relics found in the Queen's Shaft when it was opened in the 1800s, but that's a maybe. Workers' marks, however, I do find quite likely, which will be really awesome to read, but probably will be similar to those found in the king's relieving chamber and not really tell us anything new. There are a few other things it could be, but with less and less likelihood. I know that even some of my grounded fans like Jean-Pierre Houdin's model, but to me, let me put this diplomat, screw it. His engineering degree doesn't make him any less of a grifter. His ideas of the Grand Gallery may have fit with what we knew when he came up with them in the 90s, but if he's still selling that, I think he's either doing so knowing it's wrong or has his head so far up his own ass that he can't smell what's real anymore. When presented with the new void, he added all this to his diagram. None of that is in the ScanPyramids data, so what the fuck? Dude, there is nothing wrong with saying you were wrong. Retract it and move on. Your internal ramp ideas still hold some plausibility. Concentrez-vous l'audacieux, car c'est de la fantasy. Going further into the bullshit, I guess it could be an overflow pipe for an ancient water pump, or power plant, or chemical factory, or the location of the Ark of the Covenant, but that's not science. I can give you maybe this, maybe that, but that's not the same as prediction. That's just throwing everything at the wall and hoping one of them turns out to be right. Science can predict with much more specificity. Science predicts a 4th dynasty structure, likely a weight-relieving chamber, or at very least, a series of small rooms that match rooms in other known 4th dynasty mastabas and pyramids. So, to the alternative history people, predict. What goes in the space above the Grand Gallery? What will we find there? Now's your chance to show that your ideas are logical and can be extrapolated from. For electrical or chemical theories, you guys should find it really easy to predict what's there. What's missing from your formulas? Because the physics of electricity is really, really, really well understood. And chemicals with like 10 atoms? We know that really well too. I'm even kind of in both fields. Some of you may remember, if you're a longtime viewer, that I do software in the silicon industry. But my company neither sells software nor makes computer chips. Our clients produce chips. I'm very sure that I'm not allowed to show you my lab, but it's very similar to this picture I found on the internet. And we make these kinds of machines that monitor and perform chemical recipes. So in my job, I'm constantly talking to electrical engineers and chemists. They sure can make very accurate and specific predictions regarding their electronics or chemicals. Can alternative pyramid theories do that? Getting back on topic, I also want to mention again that this stone in the king's chamber that ancient architects pointed out 5 years ago is not load-bearing. Also, someone chose to dig into the floor right next to it. It sticks out slightly from the rest of the wall, and the sarcophagus would fit through the hole left by that stone. Theoretically, this could lead to whatever the void is. I proposed a tunnel here as well as an explanation for the bend in the shafts leading out. Possibly it's backfilled, but a small tunnel doesn't show up on muographs anyway. If, when we get a camera into the void, we see further tunnels leading out from it, oh Lord, I cannot imagine the speculation. So we have to be careful to not come to strong conclusions from this preliminary data. We all know what media will do with even a hint of something interesting. But I think we also make the mistake sometimes to be too careful in our speech and make it seem like we know next to nothing, when after analyzing the ScanPyramids data for ourselves, we were able to be fairly confident in many of our assumptions. In my opinion, we can be nearly certain of the location, size, and shape of the void from just this first round of data, which further allows us to make logical speculations like we've done. Thank you for listening. Please write your comments of what you think we're going to find in this great void, and we can all come back in a year or so and see how right we were. It'll be fun. And subscribe if you wish to continue to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors together.